eradicating polio? And what exactly is polio?
Polio is not a synonym for paralysis. Most people, the vast majority of people, even at the height of where people were contracting paralysis, they would get exposed to the polio virus, which is a gastrointestinal virus that looked like the stomach flu. What people don't realize is that there are at least 7 or 8 other families of viruses that can cause paralysis. So when they show you these pictures of kids from Africa or people with a limb that's, deformed, or they're dragging a limb, they're saying, see, this was polio. Well, it may have been one of the other viruses that cause paralysis.
Poliomyelitis is a description of what happens physiologically in the body, where the anterior horn of the spinal cord is altered, and then the nerves and the muscles have downstream effects. And they can vary in intensity and duration, and it also can affect the brainstem. And those are the worst kinds of poliomyelitis. Those are the ones where the breathing centers are shut down, and the iron lung was needed at the time, and you could die from that one. I also want to remind people that even during the worst outbreaks of polio, 95%. So if we had 100 people and we infected all of them with polio, which is it's a virus that's swallowed, that 95% of them wouldn't even know that they had an infection. There would be no symptoms whatsoever, and there would be immunity. And then 4% would maybe have some malaise, maybe some muscle aches, some diarrhea, and then recover. And then 1% would have paralysis of 1 or 2 muscle groups that would last for 24 hours. And that 5 to 10% of those could have long-term paralysis. So the poliomyelitis was actually a very low incidence disease. Poliomyelitis, being a description of a physiology, doesn't actually tell you what the cause is. So that's really key to understanding what polio was and why we say it's eradicated in the United States. Even though we have cases of poliomyelitis today, we don't necessarily have poliovirus-induced cases of poliomyelitis, because the fact is that even back in the 1940s and 1950s, that any one of a number of infections could have caused poliomyelitis. And that was actually determined later, after the vaccine was released, when outbreaks would occur, and the authorities wanted to distinguish what was actually poliovirus from what wasn't. And what they found was that roughly a little more than 1/4 was poliovirus, and the rest were other viruses, Coxsackie virus, etc., that can cause paralysis. And then they found no virus at all in a lot of people. So, DDT and arsenic are known causes of anterior horn spinal cord disease that can mimic poliomyelitis from start to finish, even from the sore throat, the feeling of swelling in the throat, the fevers, the aches and pains, to a T.
I was under the assumption that polio was synonymous with paralysis, but apparently I was mistaken, as 95% of people with polio have no symptoms whatsoever, and less than 1% of the people with polio actually suffer paralysis. Dr. Humphreys just mentioned that DDT and arsenic are both known causes of anterior horn spinal disease, which looks just like paralytic polio. Let's learn more about this intriguing subject from Dr. Rashid Buttar.
What's really interesting is when you start looking at the incidence of usage of certain chemicals. For example, I wasn't alive at that time, and neither were you, but back in the 40s, they used to say, in 50s, they used to say, I've had my DDT, so I'm insect-free, or something like that.
I've seen a cartoon, and there was in newspapers at that time that said DDT is good for me.
That's right. DDT is good for me, right.
Yeah.
And flies won't bother me because I have had my DDT. Okay? There were little slogans like that.
Yeah.
Remember, like in the 50s and 60s, again, not remember because you and I weren't alive then, we were in the 60s, but not in the 50s, but they used to actually say cigarettes. A cigarette a day will keep the doctor away.
Yeah, a pack a day keeps lung cancer away. I've seen that one too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these are strange things that they believed back then, right? Now we're talking about vaccines are important, and they've stamped out all these diseases. Well, you look at polio. So polio is supposed to have been stamped out because of vaccines. That's BS. You look at on a graph on the use of DDT, and you look at the incidence of polio, and they are exactly the same graph, except that polio followed DDT by about 6 months. So as DDT peaked, 6 months later polio peaked. DDT comes down, 6 months later polio comes down. DDT flatlines, polio flatlines. It follows the contour. It's like taking the same graph and just displacing it by 6 months.
Invented in the late 19th century as a nerve gas chemical weapon, in 1938 DDT was repackaged for use as a mosquito killer. It was applied liberally from 1943 through 1952 on swimming pools and school cafeterias full of children. I checked out the graphs, and Dr. Buttar was 100% accurate. The rise and fall of polio does actually correspond with the usage of DDT. Notice that in 1948, the DDT usage was at its lowest, and then in 1951, it was at its highest. Now, look at this graph of polio cases beginning in 1950. As you can clearly see, they peaked in 1951-1952 with approximately 58,000 cases. Then they began to decline drastically. In 1955, the year that polio vaccine was introduced, there were 28,985 cases of polio. Is it possible that many cases of polio were actually DDT poisoning? Is it possible that the decrease in DDT was a contributing factor in the reduction of polio cases? Or are there other factors as well?
Back in the late 1950s and 1960s, they actually legally changed the definition of polio when they came out with the polio vaccine. They made it much more difficult to diagnose cases of polio when they came out with the polio vaccine. So that was partially responsible for making the vaccine look more effective than it was at the time.
They did a couple of things. So in the beginning, it was highly inflated. So, for instance, in order to get subsidized, these cases that were in the hospitals and being treated, anyone could make the diagnosis of polio before the vaccine. So all it took was somebody to do an exam, 2 exams 24 hours apart, and finding 1 or more muscle groups that had paralysis. And so that would be called polio. There was no, blood or stool testing or anything like that. And then after the vaccine was released, not just anybody could confirm a case of polio, and there had to be 2 examinations done 60 days apart that showed 1 or more muscle groups that remained paralyzed for 60 days. Now, mind you, the majority of paralytic polio, even back in 1954, would resolve within 60 days. So just by changing that diagnostic criteria, they eliminated a huge amount of polio. There were cases that were called aseptic meningitis. So this was polio, but not necessarily paralysis. Those were all taken off the books as being called polio. They increased the number of cases that needed to occur in order to be called an epidemic. So these were some of the moves that were made at the time, and then they started testing for the actual virus. So that eliminated. So whether or not a vaccine ever came out, polio would have decreased probably down by 3/4, just because of the change in the criteria.
The first polio vaccine was the inactivated, in other words, the killed polio vaccine. It was developed by Jonas Salk, and it came into use in 1955. Albert Sabin's live polio vaccine was introduced in 1960. The standards for defining polio were changed in 1955 when the Salk polio vaccine was introduced. The new definition of polio epidemic required more cases to be reported. Paralytic polio was redefined as well, making it more difficult to confirm and therefore to tally. Also, after the vaccine was introduced, cases of aseptic meningitis, which is an infectious disease often difficult to distinguish from polio, were supposed to be reported as a different disease than polio. But before the polio vaccine, these cases were counted as polio. Here's a chart that's based on the Los Angeles County Health Index on morbidity and mortality of reportable diseases. As you can see, in Los Angeles County, July 1955, right before the polio vaccine was introduced, there were 273 cases of polio and 50 cases of aseptic meningitis. But then 6 years later, in 1961, there were only 65 cases of polio and 161 cases of aseptic meningitis. These numbers were 5 and 256 respectively by the year 1966. Is it possible that it only appeared that polio was eradicated because they changed the criteria for diagnosing polio and thus giving rise to the spike in cases of aseptic meningitis?
The fact of the matter is that the first vaccines that were released had live virus in them and were actually causing more paralysis than they were preventing. And that's, again, very well demonstrated in graphics from I believe it was 1954 to 1958. There's a graph in the book that shows you the amounts of poliomyelitis or paralysis that was occurring, and it was occurring largely in vaccinated populations. And the only reason that vaccine didn't cause more problems than it did was because the majority of the population was already immune to polio. So they could be injected with a live vaccine and not have an effect from it. But it would have been a disaster had it been what we call a virgin population who had never been exposed to it. It would have been an absolute medical disaster. I mean, the Cutter incident was a medical disaster where there was a very highly packed vaccine with live virus given to the public, and so Cutter basically took the rap for that problem and had to close their doors. But the truth was that Wyeth was also releasing similar vaccine.
So the Cutter incident, was that polio?
Yes, that was where the inactivation wasn't complete in those live viral particles were still in the vaccines that were being administered. So you basically, instead of swallowing your live virus, you were directly injected with it. So needless to say, the chances of that going bad were quite high.
And so just in a synopsis, then the Cutter incident is a situation where the people were actually, there was an outbreak of polio caused by the vaccine?
Yes. And actually, interestingly enough, Paul Offit wrote a very good book about the Cutter incident. It's very accurate and it's very interesting.
That is interesting that Paul Offit wrote. Okay. Has he retracted it yet?
No, because it's kind of, the reason for it was, look, we have this great vaccine that's done a great thing, and sometimes we have stumbling blocks in the beginning, and this is the story. And it's very well told and very, very good read.
The Cutter incident is an example of the polio vaccine actually causing polio because of an insufficiently killed virus in the Salk polio vaccine from Cutter Laboratories in Berkeley, California. Over 40,000 children were infected, many were paralyzed, and many died. In 1977, Dr. Jonas Salk testified, along with other scientists, that mass inoculation against polio was the cause of most polio cases throughout the USA since 1961. Are there cases of the polio vaccine causing other diseases, like cancer? What do you know, Barbara, about the Salk and Sabin versions of the polio vaccine?
Well, we know that the original Salk inactivated vaccines, polio vaccines that were given to over 100 million children, including me, I got several Salk polio shots, were contaminated with simian virus 40 because those vaccines used rhesus monkey kidney tissue cells to produce the vaccines. In 1960, an NIH scientist, Bernice Eddy, found that rhesus monkey kidney cells that were used to produce the inactivated Salk vaccine caused cancer when they were injected into hamsters. Dr. Bernice Eddy worked at the NIH, and in the 1950s, right around the year, she was given the job of looking for safety of the vaccine. And what she noticed when she was injecting hamsters with it is that they were developing tumors. That was one of the problems. And then in monkeys, she was noticing that they were becoming paralyzed and dying. So she actually noticed two problems. But when it comes to the cancer aspect, that's different than the paralysis aspect, because she was one of the first to notice that there were live viruses in the vaccine that were still causing paralysis, but nobody listened to her. So she noticed these tumors were occurring at the injection site and also distally in the lungs and the kidneys after injection. And so she decided one day to do an experiment where she just didn't even use the polio virus at all. She just took the cell cultures from the rhesus monkey kidneys and skimmed off some of the liquid that was sitting on top and injected some animals with that, and she found that they developed tumors. And then she took some of the material from that tumor and injected it into other generations and found that each time 100% of these animals developed tumors. And it was really interesting to me because as a kidney specialist, as a nephrologist, to learn about this virus, SV40, I actually only learned about it after I had left my conventional job in 2011. And I thought, well, this is so interesting that I never knew about any of the amazing research that was done in 1962, where they actually knew that this virus, the simian virus 40, which was the 40th virus that was found in these cultures that came from monkeys, actually was able to transform normal cells into cancer cells.
and that they found that this to be true in kidney cells in petri dishes, and they called it a transformative virus. In other words, a cancer-causing virus back then. And then, like, the lid came down, and after 1962, where Shine and Enders did these studies showing this, we don't hear about it anymore. This simian virus 40 that Dr. Bernicetti discovered is also relevant today to kidney specialists, and most of them don't even know it. That they find this virus in particular diseases of the kidney at a much higher rate. So about 45% of people who have a disease called focal and segmental glomerulosclerosis. It's a mouthful even for me. It's a serious disease that most people end up on dialysis, and it's very common actually. 45% of them will have simian virus 40 in their kidneys, as opposed to you and I, maybe 0 to 10% of us will have it, and even people with other kidney diseases, about 10%. So it's actually been associated with some really serious protein-losing kidney diseases that puts people on dialysis. But we don't hear about it today, and just like vaccines, it's not taught in medical school or to kidney specialists.
That's interesting. And you being a nephrologist, that's right up your alley, isn't it?
And that I had only discovered it after I left and was doing vaccine research is really interesting.
First of all, you need to understand something. To make a polio vaccine, there's an entire industry that raises monkeys. They slaughter the monkeys, they take out their kidneys, and the polio virus is actually incubated in the monkey kidneys. Okay? Now, what they do is they attenuate the virus in the monkey kidneys.
What does that mean?
Weaken.
Okay.
This is how they weaken the virus. Okay, so that it supposedly won't cause the disease when it's given to you as the human. But they didn't know at the time that the monkeys had viruses. Okay. And the viruses were not a problem for the monkeys, but they were a problem, and they are a problem when they cross species.
The problem with the polio vaccine is that it's in the category of a live virus vaccine. So what they did is they took animal cells from another species, basically sort of a chimpanzee cell, and infected that cell with a virus, and then they used it to produce, antigen or, vaccine seed stock, which then they gave to humans orally, which infected them with the virus. But when you do this process of mixing different types of animal fluids and different pathogens, they tend to adapt better to the body that you're infecting, and the immune system doesn't have an opportunity to react as strongly, and that's why they justify it, because you're not going to get full-blown polio theoretically if you take an oral polio vaccine, but what does happen is that the virus infects that person, and because the immune response isn't normal, it can stay in their body as sort of a surreptitious or low-grade infection. It could even last a lifetime. But another problem, of course, is that these cells of these other animals contain within them a number of what are known as endogenous retroviruses. And these viruses have the ability to insert into the DNA of other animals. So the chimpanzee cell in the nucleus has just hundreds of different potential viruses that when they make them into vaccines, they're reawakened and then can infect us. One of those viruses is actually known as simian virus number 40, or SV40. And the oral polio vaccine campaigns introduced this virus into literally millions of people unawares. And even today, I, for one, likely have SV40 in my body because my mom received the vaccine, so it gets passed down transgenerationally, even though I didn't receive that vaccine. So it stays in our body, it's passed down into future generations, potentially forever, and that is one of the sort of Pandora's box events that occurred in the history of vaccination.
Fast forward to the 1990s. Researchers began to culture out SV40 DNA from the tumors, the cancerous tumors, of children and adults suffering with bone, brain, and lung cancer. SV40 DNA. They made an association between the contaminated polio vaccines and the SV40 DNA that they're culturing out. Independent labs across the world confirmed SV40 DNA in these cancers. Not only adults that got the vaccines, but children. The government, the federal government, said, No association. There's no association between SV40 DNA in these tumors and the cancers. It continues to be an outstanding question about whether the people like me and others who got contaminated vaccines, contaminated with a simian virus, a monkey virus, potentially passed down to their children the SV40 DNA that then caused brain, bone, and lung cancers in these children, as well as in the adults who got them. This is still an outstanding question. Nobody wants to talk about it. You won't find anybody talking about it because the scientists in the 90s who tried to look into this and say something about it were vilified. And these were scientists from very prestigious universities. Whenever doctors and scientists try to do the right thing when it comes to vaccine risk issues, they are punished. They're punished by the government. They lose government grants. They are vilified in the media. It's the same with a physician who steps forward and tries to be honest and recognize and have a conscience and say, we need to do something different. We need to do something, care about these children. Demonized, vilified, as if, try to drum these people out of society because they were honest. This is not the way that science should be conducted. It's not the way that we should be rewarding people who are trying to do the right thing.
In 2002, the British journal Lancet published compelling evidence to support the polio vaccine linked to cancer. In the article, the authors assert that the polio vaccine contaminated with SV40 was responsible for up to half of the 55,000 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cases that were occurring each year. Dr. Maurice Hilleman was the developer of Merck's vaccine program. He developed over 36 vaccines, more than any other scientist in history. He was a member of the United States National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He received a special Lifetime Achievement Award from the World Health Organization. Hilleman was one of the early vaccine pioneers to warn about the possibility that simian viruses might contaminate vaccines. In total, over 60 different lab studies have linked the Salk polio vaccine to cancer, which Hilleman admits was the responsibility of Merck.